Hello world of YouTube and welcome to the listening log update for December of 2024. I've got 19 albums that I spun over the course of December that I will be talking about in this video, with time codes listed in the description for each individual review if you would like to skip around in this video. While I did spend a lot of the month doing backlog catch-up with as much as I could, balancing requests that were also sitting in the ether, and some of the, few releases that did drop in December that I wanted to listen to. It was a stacked month. Usually these December ones are, but this might be the longest one of these I've done in a while. So hopefully you're excited to hear me talk about these records. Give it a like if you are excited, and let's go ahead and dive on in by talking about... I've grown to learn that Shoo are going to be an act to surprise you when it comes to their new releases. They are a talented duo who have an artistry that sees them diving into these various different facets, both experimental and accessible, blending ideas that's, by the by, never fail, but do leave me in a varying degree of emotions. They have highs, and they have some records that have left me lukewarm. With this newest album, 13-inch frame Beltrame Italian Stiletto with Bison horn grips, a reference to a switchblade. We see them trying to marry some of their worlds of extremes together, and I think make for a truly tight but interesting listen through and through. That means we get moments like the opener ARP Omni, which has the elegance of a project like Oh No, one that I thought was solid, but was missing a little something. And I feel like this album presents that something without losing some of that sense of great melody and hook writing that was exhibited on a record like that. While I appreciate that side of it, and I think that it opens the record well and gives way to the much more bold Maestro 1 chord, I think that the album evens out fantastically on the guitar-driven Common Loon. I actually really like the guitar-driven approach that this album shows off in some choice instances, like on that, and on Venevictum, and on the fucking Rager Sleep Boulevard, and on the absolute stomping Sleep Boulevard, which has this great pairing of this just electronic thudding with this sleek riff work. The more straightforward melding approach that occurs on the aforementioned rock-leaning cuts and on TDF, TW, I think are where the record truly shines, though, and I think elevate this record to another level. I do really like the experimental flourishes that happen on here, like on the, again, aforementioned Maestro 1 chord, which I think acts as a good wash-in to what I like about Shoo's sound, and I think, again, has that blending on display in some ideas, but I think still creates a cool backdrop. Or the meltdown on Pale Flower that I think comes in after Common Loon and this nice little tangent. Or, again, the more beat-driven Piña, Coconut, and Cherry, which sends the album off. This was one of the albums that I teased doing in November, and I mostly wanted to sit on it through December, partially because I loved being in this world, and while I probably would have kept spinning it in December, I wanted to reaffirm that by just sitting with this for a month longer. I loved the blendings on here. I think that it's the type of experimental rock that I also loved about the Collective, which was also on my top rock albums of the year, as was this, if you saw the Blue Sky post. I just think that Shoo, comparatively to Kim Gordon, blend their very present ideas they presented in recent works into some cool cocktails that lean both in great gravitas and some choice intensity that I think present both sides beautifully. I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. This is most definitely going to end up somewhere on my best of the year list. I just don't know where yet. I think that as far as experimental rock records that have moments that lean into accessibility, this does so with grace.
Soul, jazz, rock are multicultural. Self-reflection's non-negotiable. Say hello to people in the street.
While I didn't wholly love Homeboy Sandman's first Rich in what I guess is a series of Rich albums, or at least a duology of Rich records, because its production was spotty as fuck, there were still some interesting sounds that he wanted to bring together that I was hoping maybe would get reined in into a much more well-constructed record. That is not necessarily the case with Rich 2, but it is still a record with some moments that I found myself enjoying, and for all of the parts of this record that I don't necessarily enjoy, the best thing I can say about it is that it is at least brief in how long that it sticks around. The instrumental selection on here, when it shines, I think is still pretty choice. I think that the loop on Every Day is some, like, classic throwback sounds that I absolutely dig. And, like, Mayor Coach really kind of fits the atmosphere that I think he's trying to aim for really fucking choicely. Hell, his sort of rapid-fire flow in that song is honestly one of the better highlights on the project by and large. It's got this kind of, like, character aspect that I think Homeboy Sandman's tapped into in the past really well, and I think does pretty amicably well here, too. But, like, there are some other songs that try to tap into that vibe, like The Place I Want to Be, that I don't think are all that great. I also don't think Need a Woman is a track that is one of his best by and large either. Hell, I honestly prefer, to some degree, when the album just goes full-blown out there, like Summertime into Thank You. Two purely oddball moments that really take the listener out of the experience the record's going in up to that point, but I think honestly saves the record from a low point on the album. I don't think this album sticks the landing after that all that well. Again, I already said I didn't really like The Place I Want to Be, and Dream Come True is just this kind of extended outro, which is one of a handful on here, that feel like they're trying to pad out an already brief experience, which was another issue I had with Rich. But again, ultimately, I don't think set the record amongst my least favorite of the year. It's just a record that, again, made me wish was a little bit better, like the last Rich 2. I don't remember what I gave the last Rich album, but I'm giving this one a 5. It's nothing truly astonishing, but I don't think it's anything that is wholly horrible either. It's got some real lows, but its biggest letdown is more that it fails to utilize some of its ideas in any interesting ways.
Did I say that I moved from the side? Took a plane to the west side.
Like I said up at the top, there were a couple albums that dropped in December that I had some curiosity to, and one of those was Smino's Maybe in Nirvana, an artist that admittedly I've only really gotten into the features of and haven't done a full-length dive into. I don't think Maybe in Nirvana may be the best starting point at his brand of theming and album construction. I honestly think this album honestly kind of ends while it's really getting started, unfortunately. I dig some of the atmosphere going on here and some of the fun vocal work and hook play that he's spinning on here. But those nuggets packed into this all too brief experience still have some genuine moments of shine. Like, I think that the playful, fun vocal stuff on NSYNC is pretty choice. I also like the beat on Ready Set Goku and think that, like, especially in the beginning, he starts that with some fun flow and heat. And the title track after Ready Set Goku, I think, kind of comes in a lower key realm, but keeps the atmosphere from Ready Set Goku intact. There's a couple solid collabs on here, too. I always love seeing Bun B crop up, and I think that, like, it's a testament to his longevity that he can still deliver solid features like he does on Miss Joyce. The bass play by Thundercat on Ho Nouns is also great as hell. And out of the two Raven Lene collaborations, I think Taquan might be my favorite of the two, but I think that she does pretty well on both tracks. I think that her just melody play on that just matches Smino's really well. I just think that her melody play and chemistry with Smino on Taquan is just a notch better. You may be wondering, though, why would I say this is not maybe the best starting point? It's because while I like a lot of the elements here, they just feel all too brief and left me wanting infinitely more. You know, the buoyant energy on Glowfi doesn't feel like a casting off into the sunset. It more feels like a warm-up to an actual burst of something else. On top of that, there is, like, a singular moment that I really don't enjoy, and in tandem with that, the fact that this concise-ass little record has something that wastes time like an intro just feels all too much like trying to fluff. On top of that, I think Lee is one of the bigger stumbles on here that I've just found myself skipping every time I respin this album. It's just a record that feels incomplete, honestly, and that's my biggest takeaway from it, is that while I enjoy the atmosphere, I think there's some good ideas, I think that this is a decent showing of what Smino can do. I still want to listen to the guy's other releases because I do like some of what's here. I just hope to find it in more quantities with meatier substance on the proverbial record's bones and other parts of his discography. I'm giving this a 6. I'm walking away with it, giving it a 6. It's solid. It's very, very solid. There's a lot of good ideas here. There's just not quite a bountiful amount of any of them.
The vibes great, and you get them any time of day. I like to get down. So what I'm trying to say, baby.
While this is my first time talking about hip-hop duo SaxKixAve via their third album, Terrell, Charbonneau, I'm no stranger to their sound or their work. This is my first album I'm checking out of theirs as well. I've been meaning to really give these guys a full chance for a minute now, because I dig their vibe, I dig their personality. I gotta say, on the other side of my first full-length excursion, I think that this is a pretty solid release from these two. I think that Albert, who's like the more musical side of the duo, is pretty good at using harmony and melody with the flute play and sax play to sort of dance around the instrumental, to kind of add to the instrumentals and atmosphere, while also having some moments where he gets to just goof off and have fun with Alfred, who's laying down some pretty fun and quirky bars with some nice punchlines also thrown in there. He's got some genuine talent, and I think he rides all of these instrumentals so very smoothly. You know, obviously there's a sense of elegance and swagger that he kind of teases on the introduction that comes out. Like tracks like The Infectious Arctic, which I think has a strong-ass hook, and The Meadows, which I think has a moment where he really chops it up well, while also bringing some heat on Spaghetti Western and What You Gotta Say, What I Got, What You Gotta Say. The latter being one of the moments that I don't think is as strong as other moments on the record, but it still showcases a sort of consistent through line throughout different parts of the project that I kind of enjoy. I also like that they get a little fun, like on Bee Pollen or on Albert's interlude where he raps a little bit while still getting a little awkward at the end. And honestly, I really enjoy White People in Mostly Black Spaces. I think that it's a fun jam that is a little more Albert-led, but it's a great bit, and I like it. It brings a good balance to the more serious tone or more reflective tone that happens on here. You know, Spaghetti Western kind of feels like an observance of one zone trajectory upward, and that, you know, sort of reaction and reflection on said, you know, prominence that you may have seen on your own proverbial upswing. You know, there's a real theme of this on this trying to be the moment where you make it, but also has moments where it reflects on said come up. Similarly to how I felt on records like Take Care by Big X The Plug, as far as like the mood and like just observation scene, but in a different facet considering the lanes that I think these two are kind of burgeoning up in. Those are the lighthearted songs that just absolutely feel like throwbacks, like Trying to Get Down, whose instrumental sounds like something straight out of the Sega Genesis era, and I think it's a bit choice. Not every moment in Divergent, I think, hits, and not every hook. There are some hooks that I think aren't as good as others. Like, I think Love Muffin's hook isn't really the strongest, and isn't my favorite moment to see the record sort of really come into out of the gate, but Alfred does have some great bars on there still that sort of helps bring the song back a little bit. You know, Done With the Bullshit, I think has a really good energy that I think could have started the record off a little bit more on a bombastic tone, with a hook that I think starts at 10 and explodes off the page, But that aside, this is a solid-ass project. I love their ears for music, and I love their talents they show on display here. I'm gonna give this a 7 out of 10. I think that it's very solid. And I think that if you like alternative hip-hop and you want a group that knows when to get serious, but also doesn't take themselves too seriously, these guys have some good stuff, and I think that they have some nice production behind them as well.
No more hiding. I wanna feel sun on my skin, even if it burns up.
If you notice, this album wasn't in the teaser image I made for this. I'm actually going to be talking about a few more albums than I realized, because when I was looking over what I've been spinning this month versus what I put in the promo, there's like a couple records that are off of that entirely. So it's actually going to be more like 19 to 20 albums covered in this listening log. But regardless, SZA's new album, I'm not going to call this a deluxe, to SOS, an album from 2 years ago. Lana feels like its own project. It doesn't feel like a series of like scraps or bonus tracks. It may retain the mood of SOS, and it may retain some of the themes considering the subject matter, but like, this album stands on its own, and it's frustrating to spin this and know that, at least in a meta sense, if we're talking about music as a business, this isn't going to get maybe some of the attention this isn't going to get maybe some of the attention it deserves, because there are some cool sounds, some quality hook-driven moments, and a Kendrick Lamar collaboration that give way for another great outing by SZA. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand why she may have at least released it in this fashion, given that these two records are kind of kindred spirits of a sort. They, again, kind of revolve around similar subject matter. This album, in the grand narrative of SOS, and it feels like the lead-up to that sort of isolated, nihilistic mindset that fuels some of the darker fantasies woven throughout SOS. You could almost argue the back half of this record is the lead up to the moment that happens on Kill Bill. But I love that the record has this sort of pacing and structure and flow to it that gives way to adding to the experience of that album. The actual sounds of this, though, just sit in a more lower key realm that gives it its own identity that I think stands tall. The opening sort of has this confidence to it, but again, it's in this low-key, synth-driven atmosphere that I absolutely love. I think No More Hiding is a fucking great opener to this project. It sets the mood, and honestly, alludes to where the attitude builds up to. Because from there, then you get the inciting incident of sorts that would lead to a moment like Kill Bill, where you found him cheating on you because he accidentally called you while he was doing so. And there's other narrative sort of planting and payoff in the songwriting moments, like with the Kendrick feature almost acting like a conversation between Kendrick and SZA about the incident and sort of the guy that she has been with, and BMF, which is a really fun flip on a Girl from Ipanema that sort of has some lyrical nods to the maybe conversations with Kendrick in the flip of the hook. But again, a lot of that sits in this lo-fi inspired, reverb-soaked, lower-key atmosphere that, SOS does also tap into, but there's a sense of scope on that record that enhances that isolated feeling that doesn't feel present here. It does have your more beat-forward stuff that do help sort of spice up and give tangents in this lower-key atmosphere, like Scorsese Baby Daddy and Chill Baby. But even in the moments of building to that mood, or at least building to that incident, like on Drive, Another Life, and the closer, the single Saturn, it's sort of teeing up SOS, but, even when listening to them together in this deluxe fashion, they don't transition well into each other. I know I'm getting hung up on how this album is presented, but it's partially because I feel like that's going to set back Lana as a project. I really enjoy a lot of what this album has going on, and I want it to be seen as more than just a deluxe version of a great album, but not necessarily the same as this. I like how you can see this sort of mood shift in the middle of the record across tracks like My Turn and Cry Baby. Again, where some of that confidence really comes to fray, you can see that sort of internal fire burgeoning out. And I really like that by the time Kitchen and Get Behind Me sort of come around, the points that really feel like the straw that breaks the camel's back in this conversation, there's a cattiness beneath that stands at the forefront that I really appreciate, that could again lead to where SOS would have picked up in the grand scheme after this. I don't know, I really appreciate this album. Sure, there are some songs that I've gotten less warm to the more that I've respun this, like Diamond Boy and Love Me For Me, but the emotional core of a track like Love Me For Me is still really strong, and I like the more bluesy side of Diamond Boy. I like that there are some moments on here where some fun guitar play gets to come into the fray. Even if I don't think this might be my favorite SZA album, I still think that it's a solid-ass follow-up and sort of prequel to the duology she was constructing maybe all along. I don't know, I'm giving this a 7. I don't know anything about the behind the scenes of this. It's a record that I could ultimately see, unfortunately, just glazing past people. Another in the handful of TikTok artists that dropped albums in 2024 that I'm talking about in the December 2024 listening log update, Boy Jr. with I Love Getting Dumped, their latest album following my introduction to them, the album from a couple years ago, Pay Attention to Me, an album that sort of sees them in a similar realm to the follow-up EP to that, going through a breakup, but really takes the listener through the dimensions of first breaking up with somebody, that post-breakup sort of intermission where you may still be in contact with that person, and then your own self-pillaging off of that, all while throughout getting more and more into the idea of that person not being around in your life. You know, it has cattiness. You know, it has this attitude through and through, where they're definitely embracing the action, but they sort of turn their aggression both inward and outward in some really interesting facets, all while creating a soundscape that I think evolves in some of what I like from Pay Attention to Me, while also finding a way to put those sound into a little more of a catchy, well-harnessed, better harnessed atmosphere. You know, I really enjoy, you know, I love the noise and like the more edgier sounds that crop up on here on songs like I Hope You Feel Terrible and Bullying Myself, and some of the razor-sharp sounds on Threw Me Out the Window. They definitely match the attitude of those songs, but I also like how they have a sense of true beauty and just good melody work. Like on the equally still catty but mellow as hell opener, Your Mama's Disappointed in You. That same mellowness put in even more of a minimal scope when, you know, really getting sad with it, like on Unfortunately. It's not like the 7 stages, it's not like the 5 stages of grief on display throughout a project, but I love where those emotions still go throughout the journey of this record, and how a semblance of acceptance does get felt in chunks of this, but it ultimately feels like the mood on the other side of this record. The moments where guitars really get to stand on the forefront do add a bit more dynamics to the very synth-laden atmosphere, and adds a good pairing to some of those ideas, while keeping the mood just fully intact. I also love how the ebb and flow of energy gets to create some really fun moments in sequencing, like how Top 5 Most Emotional People in Western New York punches through that minimal ambience and creates, again, a synth-filled banger with a good sense of density and punchiness in the drums. The same kind of happens when the funky groove of Bullying Myself comes into the fray after Legolas. It kind of slows things down into a nice swagger that, again, accents some of the punchier production ideas that I really love throughout this project. It's a strong-ass album. As far as an act really understanding what worked about their sound, reining it in, focusing it while still going deeper on an emotional level, I think that this does so tenfold. I really like this release. I hope that they continue to experiment and push their sounds farther, even with the looming sort of TikTok ban. I hope that that was like just a slice of their particular sort of draw they pulled from facets of the internet. But as it stands with this project, I think it's great. I think it's really, really great. I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10. It's a strong-ass pop album. If you like pop albums that are equal parts catchy and dynamic, that take the listener on a good journey, there's some good stuff here.
I am held captive by the ribbon.
Prelude to Ecstasy by The Last Dinner Party is one of those albums that I had seen, even from jump, getting a lot of praise, and I had interest in it even early on, but I kept pushing it farther and farther back on my backlog, but knew by year's end I had to spin it. And so I had been throughout December, and I gotta say, a lot of the hype that I've seen, absolutely justified. This album is pretty damn good. I think that as far as striking this balance of elegance and pristineness with a nice clean production and a harnessing of very pop-driven but still rooted in glam and rock ideas, I think that records like this show that sometimes with the right musicianship and vision, the classics can still sound great in a modern sense. There's a lovely sway across parts of these songs that I think sees these four ladies just creating some beautiful harmony across the music. You know, whether it's the swagger on Caesar on a TV show that has this lovely build to it throughout its chorus, into the even more soft but still tight The Feminine Urge. While it didn't necessarily end up on my favorite rock albums of the year list that I dropped on Blue Sky yesterday, it did end up on my best pop albums of the year list, because I'd argue this, like some other records that I threw in the pop albums list, have a utilization of hook and melody within its construction that very much fall within those realms. Like, yes, there's a lot of guitar beneath the pianos and synths and other senses of elegance that happen in the accompaniment, like the flute-led Beautiful Boy and the sort of synth stabs that linger beneath the bright melodies of Sinner, feel like some just grade A pop excellence. Sinner honestly evokes the same energy that, like, the Gorillaz self-titled does in some of its sounds and ideas, and I honestly adore it for that. Especially when it comes to, like, just being very infectious and bright. That song is catchy as hell, and I absolutely love it. I love the bass groove beneath those sharp synth stabs as well. The more lower-key moments, like Portrait of a Dead Girl, that, you know, leads into the slow burn but really grand by the end, penultimate Nothing Matters, is some just great album sequencing at its finest. And as far as the lyrical tapestry to all this music goes, I think that it is penned so very sharply. I really love how deep it goes on subjects like generational trauma, on the feminine urge, or how you see these subjects of love and vengeance against, you know, past loves come to the light and sort of add to some of the swagger and elegance in both breaths. You know, there may be a tight groove to a track like Sinner, but the way that it talks about feeling outcasted and pent up, considering your surroundings, it almost urges the listener to dance harder to the groove to get those pent up emotions out, and I really love how they pull that off. Also, if we're talking about, like, moments across tracks on a record that just sound so perfectly unified together, honestly, that stretch from Sinner through Mirror act as this moment of getting fed up with being pent up and isolated, realizing your true self, acting on your true self, and enjoying the consequences and a reflection of said consequences as the album sends itself into the horizons. I think that this album is pretty damn great. I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10. It's absolutely on my top 50 albums of the year list. It was obviously one of my favorite pop records of 2024. Even if it is a little more rock-leaning, it was just shy of my rock list, because surprisingly, it was a year stacked with albums in that genre that were choice as fuck Still a great album, though. Absolutely a dazzling debut, and I hope that these ladies build onto this with some true excellence.
Take a picture in the light, digital first.
I'm not gonna lie, I completely skipped out on Dope Girl Chronicles by Field Medic because I didn't like Light Is Gone 2's pivot into a more synth-forward sound that much. I really enjoy Field Medic's brand of meldings of folk and bedroom lo-fi sounds together. Sure, he's adorned like synth beats beneath his guitar, but an outright abandoning of that I just don't think suited him nearly as well. But I didn't want to count him out because I think that he is a really talented artist. He's good at creating these emotional, grounded, personal songs across a record. So when I saw that amongst the December releases he was dropping a new album, Boundless and True, I figured I would give it a shot. And I'm happy to hear that he is diving deeper back into his more acoustic and country and folk adjacent sounds and creating a record that I would say is a solid bounce back into these realms. With the sliding back into that style comes that more personal driven lyrical palette getting to shine in a lo-fi atmosphere. But a part of this that I really enjoy is how there are moments of clarity, self-realization that kind of occur in the lyrics that lend to some moments of real catharsis and some positive improvements made in life. Sure, there's still some coming-of-age sounding stuff, like the second track, I Love You Mama, but I gotta know, so I'm leaving now. This sort of simple, acoustic, harmonica-paired, sort of stomp-led jam that kind of feels like a coming-of-age song, where the protagonist is sort of finding it hard to tell his mom that he's actually trying to grow as an adult. But it sort of gives way in the track listing to the very cathartic and more intimate feeling, I Love Being Sober, which feels like something within the wheelhouse of Field Medic sound-wise, but lyrically has this moment of, again, realization that I think shines some real inner sadness beneath some of the airy reverb acoustics going on here. On the other side of that, though, there's also moments like one of these shorter songs on here I feel inspired by My Friendly Orthodontist, where he sort of recounts just a really nice adult conversation he had with his orthodontist that helped inspire him to take better care of himself, something that sort of comes in the same wheelhouse of those self-realizations. It's a nice other side of the coin to some of the sadness and inner bleak feelings that have been a part of Field Medic's repertoire in pockets. And really that kind of trademark Field Medic shorter song approach is still the driving force on a lot of this, you know, catharsis, getting the sunny portrayal, like on the duet Camel Filter Cigarette, or again on another really touching poetic moment like a book worth reading, really just cute but nicely written song to glean praise to somebody that you love. And that's not to pull away from the longer songs on here, because I do think that some of them act as a moment for Field Medic to really use some nice accompaniment and honestly some cleaner production, like on Kira, You're a Spirit, or some fun banjo playing shakers that would take the place of like a beat tape on a different track like Momentary Suspension. Those pockets are meant to sort of flesh out some of these smaller nuggets that get some time to shine and sort of carry the listener throughout the track listing, and adds to the sort of interpersonal pacing that I feel like Field Medic really does well on his records. I think it does kind of meander a bit more so than other records that I like more in his discography, but I think that as far as reaffirming one's own talents in their own lane, Boundless and True definitely does do that, even if it does get a bit too bogged down in itself or wrapped up in itself in some spots. I still think this is a solid-ass release and another nice notch in his discography, and I'm going to give this a 7 because it's a nice-ass record by an artist that I do think has some good songwriting chops in him.
Poxy and think I'm tasting the money and look like I ate a few hundred. Just hopped on a G6, I'm getting hit while I'm playing my Switch.
For those that may not remember, when I reviewed Megan Thee Stallion's Act 1 to her Megan maybe trilogy, at least duology, I thought it was another step in the right direction for Megan making a more concise listening experience. You know, while I loved While I like Trombozine's track listing by and large, I ended up doing a redacted on it, and I think that Megan really laid out her ideas in a much more well-constructed manner. I think that Act 2 doubles down on that tenfold, honestly, too. I think that while it has some sort of deviations and other ideas, I think that those ideas end up blending in the cocktail that she's got going on here and creating an experience that I think is still empowering in all the ways that Megan knows how to be, and absolutely hard in a handful of fashions. You know, the opener, Big in Texas, is a track that definitely feels classic Texas in sound with its use of low end and hi-hats. I think that her flow on that track is tight as hell, and I think that it kicks the album off really strongly. I think that Bourbon, honestly, after that, continues that sound, but flips the mood ever so slightly in a way that I think is choice as hell. I also like that she does another fantastic collab with one of the handful of pop rap ladies that have been popping off right now on Rocksteady. I think that is a really solid flip of 1-2 Step and a solid collab with Flo Milli. And I like that she included a remix of Mamushi on here. It sort of helped keep this in line with the Megan series, but I think it keeps the attitude that this specific act is channeling forward more to the front and center. I also love that following it comes one of two more metal-inspired tracks with the Spiritbox collaboration TYG. I thought that it was a wild swerve the first time I listened to it, but I think the fact that He Think I Love Him later on in the track listing helps sort of keep those sounds in the listener's minds, helps unify the album all the more. You know, I also think that happening right before the Like a G6 flip on Like a Freak is great as hell too. There's just, again, a good use of laying the shit out, letting it flow, and creating a great experience out of it. This is another really fucking awesome album. If you didn't know, Megan Thee Stallion was like one of my top streamed albums of the year, partially because I was listening to a lot of Traumazine and Megan, but this also further adds to the roster of Megan continuing on her pilgrimage to being one of the best doing it right now in her lane. I'm giving this shit an 8. I was gonna give it a 7. Fuck that. I'm giving it an 8. I'm probably gonna give Megan an 8, retroactively as well. Really looking back on Megan Act 1, it's a fucking, the, step she needed to, really lock it in. She's locked the fuck in on that. She's locked the fuck in on this. If she's doing an Act 3, I'm honestly really stoked to see where she goes with it. Fuck yeah. Even though frequent commenter and longtime viewer Rockin' Movies with Tyler requested the newest Opeth record, Last Will and Testament, I was going to check it out anyway. I just intended to check it out well before this point and talk about it maybe around the time it came out. However, I will say prior to spinning it, I was stoked and intrigued at the very least to see them integrate aggressive vocals back into the fray sonically. You know, while I was hoping it would pivot their sound even more towards the sort of golden era that they had earlier in their career, and sort of stray further away from the more prog-laden sounds that they've adorned over the last handful of records. This doesn't quite do that. I will say, it's a solid melding of both worlds, and they do have some moments where they use the harsh vocals to sort of cut through those proggy moments and create some interesting pivots in sound. I will say I don't think some songs use them quite as effectively as others. While I think that some of the accompaniment on the 6th Jam, which these songs are all sort of loosely titled, they're all sort of vaguely titled with a coda to send things off to tie into the concept that I don't have a whole lot of interest in. I've never watched Succession, which is something that this shares a concept with, which I think if I'd watched that show I may find a little more intrigue in. And that's not to say a slap at Succession. I've heard it's a great show. I just don't watch a whole lot of scripted stuff anymore. I feel like the older that I get, the less and less I watch of that. And I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing, because I feel like this would be a good time to sort of catch up on older shows, older dramas, and watch some newer ones that are on my proverbial bucket list. As it stands, though, while there is a solid blending of ideas from the aggressive and proggy atmospheres on here, this still isn't my favorite record by the band. The sixth song, I think, has sort of use of production. Every instrument has a nice pocket and rides that pocket well. There's a nice drum and bass dancing, weaving around each other on that song that I think is nice. But I don't think that, like, the use of, like, this aggression to cut through that prog is all that interesting. You know, especially when compared to, like, the first song, which I think uses the vocals to sort of create this resolve that the song uses very effectively, and to sort of, like, introduce this concept. And I think gives way to another really solid second song, which leans more into the gravitas side of their prog experimentations, and I think does so relatively well. You know, the album definitely goes deep on that in some regards, like Song 3 and Song 4 especially. Song 4 has this, like, flute-ass section that is wild as fuck, and is definitely, like, a nice little deviation, but again, like, but I do think kind of gets swept up in itself in certain spots. You know, I think on paper this is a very interesting record and an interesting concept for them to tackle, but I just don't think that, like, their use of sonics wholly balances on this. It's got some highs, it's got some cool sort of sonic excursions, and it's got some fun blendings, but they did leave me wanting a little more and a little less in some regards on both sides. I still want to give this like a 6 out of 10 because it's very, very solid. I just don't think that it's would rank anywhere amongst my favorite within Opeth's discography. I may be new to the band Fontaines DC, but this is their 4th studio album. I gotta say, I kinda hate that I've been sleeping on this band given how much I think this is a quality release, but I checked it out. Similarly to the reasons why I checked out The Last Dinner Party, I had seen Romance, this album in particular, getting a lot of buzz throughout the year. Not necessarily wholly in the same circles, but even then, in some wider circles. This is an album that's been getting spades of success for this band, and I'm happy for them. You know, while Romance is sort of the billing card for some of the mood of this, there's definitely a darkness underneath that I think this band does a great job at pulling to the forefront throughout this experience in some select ways. You know, it starts the record with a foreboding tone, and while the album sort of resolves around in a bit more of some optimistic or some, again, romantic sort of leaning desires, the soundscape doesn't always accent that brightness. You know, while I enjoy the infectious, jangle-fueled Bug, and I think that it is a shining moment amidst some of the more seedier ideas, a track like Desire or Starburster have this deep-seated internal feeling beneath those lustful ideas that sort of come out in the soundscape that I think that the band sort of puts on display brilliantly. I also really like the production on this thing. You know, not only do the jangly sounds sound great as like an accent to the backdrop, some of the bass and guitar really sort of hit the listener with a strong sense of tone, and again, help enhance that atmosphere. Like on the penultimate Death Kink, in particular, has some nice bite to its guitars that I think help sway the record into a really nice conclusion. Same could be said for Here's the Thing, which I think's helped finally ignite some fire through the first couple of tracks that sort of slowly build to that ignition. Similarly to a band like The Last Dinner Party too, I like how this group sort of flirts with other sonic inspiration outside of the realms of like guitar-driven music to help accent their mood as well. Like the strings that help fill the ambience on hoarseness or the whatness, or the same strings that sort of add to the slow burn build in the sort of one of the few moments that dissect away from the more lustful and romance-laden lyrics on In the Modern World, that sort of pulls the scope out a bit more and very much feels like a song sort of about the fame, which could tie into some of those themes, but I think it's a nice sort of just good, bold sounding song. A nice sort of big song to sandwich between two moments of sort of energy shifting. There's a lot of really good ideas on this record, and I can see why it got a lot of praise that it did. I kind of wish I'd got into it earlier in the year just to add on to that hype train, but as it stands to sending 2024 off in the horizons, I do think that this is a strong album, and it did end up on the lower end of my 10 favorite rock albums of last year, because I think it is a strong release that has a good sound, where the band that has a good sense of unity and sort of their compositional style. And I think I've made a really strong album here that has me interested in the rest of the discography. I want to give this an 8 out of 10. It's not my favorite rock album, obviously. It's not my favorite album of its genre of the year, obviously. But I think it is one of the best ones that Lane had seen over the last 12 months.
Talk to me nicely, or it's click bang with a Ruger, neck 5 of ejections, straight face when I back to. And if it's
now, the last out of the artists I discovered through TikTok that dropped albums in 2024 that I ended up talking about in this December wrap-up, that I'm going to talk about in said wrap-up, are British rap duo Pete and Baz. Artists like them and the Northern Boys crop up on my TikTok feed from time to time. I've heard these guys for a bit now, but I've never spun an album of theirs in full, and I figured I would, given their newest album had a couple of songs that were popping off on my For You page a lot. Ironically enough, they were the remixes, especially in the case of Mugshot Freestyle, and it almost felt like should have just been the version on the album. This album feels like it's trying to lean into the business side of like up-and-coming music in a way that like I don't think is necessarily beneficial when listening to this as an album. But I also think that, like, by and large, outside of some of the truly tight flows that these two tap into, and they have an energy on this that in some spots creates some solid tracks. Yeah, Bish Bash Bosh is kind of directionless in its hook, something that, like, where they shine on tracks like T-Pain and admittedly like Mugshot Freestyle and Goodfellas, does have some decent, you know, spitting in the verses. It sounds like they only used like a couple of different producers for at least this record, and one of them has the wildest producer tag, and it is kind of jarring given it's like a flip of a classic Dexter line, and that being swept in with these like hardcore gangster bars is just a vibe, but it's a weird one. I also think that some of the beats on here aren't like anything special. They more act as the vehicle for, again, those very vivid flows that Pete and Baz tap into. I don't think their wordplay on some tracks culminates to a whole lot. Like, I think Slap the Stick is a song where it sounds like they're kind of spinning in circles in an uninteresting way. And I don't really think they have all that much chemistry on a track like Action Man. On top of having, like, a couple of skits on an already really short project, this album just kind of feels like it's selling itself short to sort of get in and get out, which leads to a smattering of ideas that are like okay, but also a handful of ones that feel like they could have just been retooled to make a more enriching experience as a whole. This thing isn't anything that I would write home about. I know that there's much better British hip-hop out there, and I feel like as far as being an act that like is a fun shtick, it's got moments where that shines, but it's also got moments where it kind of just sits in a realm of mediocrity. I'm going to give this a 5 out of 10. Some of the beats are choice, some of the verses are solid, but there's other stuff that I just kind of wish was a little better.
1, here comes the 2 to the 3 to the 4. Tell them bring another round, we need...
Even though it's well known, I'm not a guy that dips his toes into country much, I couldn't escape Shaboozy's A Bar Song, and I think it is a great interpolation of Tipsy and a great country song written around that. It very much evokes just a good time at a bar. It's just it's a quintessential country topic done very well, and it got me curious to see what an album of his would be like, and here we are with Where I've Been Isn't Where I'm Going. An album that I would honestly argue is a pretty decent presentation of what it seems like his MO is in a very digestible and decently produced fashion. Ironically enough, while his big song is this sort of like blending of worlds, there are moments where genre-wise he kind of does the same, with decent success, like on the opener Horses and Hellcats, or the collaboration with, ironically enough, a different artist I got into, Big X the Plug, on The Drink Don't Need No Mix. I honestly kind of like the opener more than the collab, but I don't think the collab necessarily falters. I think it might be amongst my favorite collabs, but I will say I think that My Fault, a collab with Nova Cyrus, I think is absolutely fantastic, and I think stands above the rest of the collabs. It sits at a point in the record where it feels like there's a clear, picturesque story being told throughout the following tracks. From East of Macedon through Let It Burn, there's a point of Shaboozy talking about skipping town and getting out, with Highway being this really catchy, but just nice, sort of like kinetic enough song to evoke the feeling of kind of like hopping on the highway. I think Let It Burn is another bombastic, booming, catchy song, but I will admit I think Highway, amidst that sandwich, is the best of the three. By the by, I think that there's a lot of solid jams as a whole. Like, I do like Let It Burn. Again, I think that My Fault is a solid collab. And I think that Last of My Kind is also a solid, catchy collaboration. There's a handful of tracks in the back end that I don't like nearly as much as parts of the front. Like, Vegas is a fine enough song, but it's not my favorite. And admittedly, I don't think that the album finishes on its strongest moments either. But the road to that finale definitely has some highlights. As someone who is an outsider to the genre, I definitely like what Shaboozy is doing here. I think that as far as being a storyteller, harnessing an atmosphere, and also finding ways to blend sounds and influences, I think that he does so pretty solidly on here. It's not my favorite amongst the genre, because ironically enough, I did spin a couple of country records here and there, but this is still a great listen. I feel like if you enjoy the genre, you'll find some stuff to enjoy from here outside of the smash single that was everywhere in 2024. I'm giving this a 7 out of 10. I think that it is a great album.
Anything for you. I wanna move mountains and
As painful as heartbreak can be, sometimes it can bring out some of the most beautifully put together music. Case in point, Lively Premonition by Jordana, an album that sees the real-time transition of the picture somebody has in their mind's eye before the reality of your dynamic with them starts to really set in, with a series of just well-produced, catchy bangers to carry the listener through that experience. And what's ironic is, while especially the last three flurry of songs, Anything for You, The One I Knew, and Your Story's End, really start to round the bend, the one thing I continue to find electrifying about this album is just how bright some of that realization sounds from like a sonic perspective. Even when this album really breaks it down and gets real, you know, and there's almost like the realization on a track like Anything for You of your undying love and appreciation for this person feeling not reciprocated, there's still just this super sunny hook fueling a song like that I just absolutely admire. And that shininess does brighten some of the more optimistic shades that this album paints with. Like on the absolute forlorn fuel down bad anthem Like a Dog, where the sentiment is just craving that kind of loyalty and compassion. Something that feels like gets doubled down on an almost blind self-reaffirmation, like on This Is How I Know. Those moments bring that brightness into a realm of reality, even if they kind of feel a little delusional by the album's end. They're still just very big and catchy, and well, you know, orchestrated. A lot of the sounds on here are a mix of this, like, sunshine-inspired pop, and some of, like, the modern indie pop stylings. You know, there's a There's a slick groove amidst the pianos of Like a Dog that feels like a melding of past and present. The same can be felt on a track like Multitudes of Mystery, whose drum production has this very modern touch, while these acoustics sort of dance around that in a very vintage way. Those lo-fi interjections creating an even more modern sound amidst those older ideas that I think come together in a beautiful harmony. Honestly, the cleanness on this reminds me of the cleanness adorned by a band like Magdalena Bay, and I feel like there's a weird, like, crossing of worlds sonically on a track like Raver Girl. That song in particular sounds like something that could have been an offcut of Mercurial World if they sort of toned down the synthetics a bit, but I really love how that song sort of takes the modern backdrop of components of a track like Multitudes of Mystery and really pushes them a step farther for just a little bit of this record's runtime. But by the by, this is all just very clean, acoustic-backed sounds that I think if you love the sort of modern indie pop scene and want more just really well-constructed, catchy, and also very lovey, even if in sort of like a Cardigans Love Fool sort of sense, this is a good record to go to for some of those ideas. I really like this. I think that it's a strong record. And this is also a request from Mark from Fully Involved, longtime friend and day oneer of the channel. Thank you for this request, Mark. And I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. It's going to end up somewhere on my Of the Year list, and I think that if you want one of the best pop albums of the year, look no farther than right here.
We've been through high, every corner of the sky.
Even if reception to Coldplay's latest album, Moon Music, has been meddling at best, I wanted to give it a shot, if only because I thought their last album, Music for the Spheres, was better than the album that it was following up, and I thought that it was, while a very sterile, ambient-forward, and pop-centric approach, it was solid at the end of the day. With the track listing laid out how it was very similarly to that album, I had even more intrigue, and on the other side, it's fine enough. I do still like it more than Everyday Life, and I think that as far as, like, being the quote-unquote XY to Music for the Spheres, as far as keeping the tonality from that record and the mood, but sort of adapting it in other ways, this does so successfully in some ways, and meddlingly in others. While I think it might take a little too long to really get going, as it were, like, I enjoy the sort of smooth sounds across the piano-led Moon Music, and feels like I'm falling in love after that, playing this sort of minimal groove that sort of flourishes out in its own ways. I personally think that the first moment of at least quality consistently is We Pray. I don't think that Chris Martin really adds a whole lot to the song, but I think the soundscape of it is, again, just clear as fuck when doing this, like, spacey, inspired vibe. And I honestly really like seeing Little Sims in particular with these guys, but Burna Boy's okay here as well. And I think that the next couple of tracks after that do a better job at using whether minimalism or these ambient soundscapes to create some decent songs. Like, I really love the euphoric rush that Jupiter sort of reaches, and I think that Good Feelings is another solid collaboration and a nice, bouncy, groove-driven song, something that I think crops up again in a better sense on Eterna later on in the album. But I think that by and large, this album hits a decent stride. While I think the Rambo Emoji song has, again, a good use of atmosphere, it kind of meanders a little bit, and I'll be honest, I don't really love the way that this project sort of just slowly plods into the horizon, but I think that there's a decent amount of stuff here that I think nets relatively positive for them, or at least neutral. You know, I don't think that there's anything that's outright bad on here, but I really don't think they're doing anything super interesting or innovative in the farther stretches of music. I think that, again, it is better than their worst, but it still doesn't really reach amongst what I would say is the best of their discography. I'm going to give this a 5 out of 10. It is fine, which is fine. I don't necessarily think I have high hopes for a lot of Coldplay's output nowadays, but I do think that it is interesting to see what sort of stirrings do lie within an era for this band. And this still has moments of that.
Ain't gonna happen to me.
Ariana Grande has honestly had a very wild year, and while I don't plan on seeing Wicked, Rachel's seen it twice now, and I knew, again, similarly to other records that I talk about this month, I was going to get to Eternal Sunshine eventually. I wasn't the most excited to listen to it, even if the only song I had heard from it was the lead single, Yes And. I really didn't like Yes And. While it had that sort of catty energy that I really enjoyed from pockets of a record like Thank You Next, I don't think it channels that energy quite as well through the facets of, like, throwback nostalgiaism that spun throughout some of the sonics and, you know, ideas woven throughout some of the backdrops of this record, which details another messy relationship that Ariana is in. I think that there are records that are very solid on here and stand above that single, but I really don't like Yes And. I think that it's just not... I get the energy she's going for, the sort of, like, channeling that real snotty drama in through that sort of attitude scene throughout the, like, 90s dance inspo, but I just don't think it hits the nail on the head. There are other songs that sort of adorn that 90s brand of sort of vintage twist that I think do stick the landing a little better, like True Story. That's honestly kind of beside the point, because the core of this album isn't that kind of soundscape, which I think makes the choice to lead with Yes And a little more puzzling. Honestly, I would have led with the real opener song, Bye. I think that it starts the record off on a strong punctuation, and I think it's a better showcase of the album's overall soundscape. There's a more focus on sort of like a soft palette. You know, there's a lot of reverb-soaked stuff here that does lean into different inspos, like some disco revivalism, like on Bye, or on the more synth-heavy and low-key tracks like the other single, We Can't Be Friends, Wait For Your Love, and I Wish I Hated You. The latter, I think, is the better of the two. I really don't like either single from the song's era. I like We Can't Be Friends more than Yes And, but I just think, like, the other highlights on this album stand above those singles. I think the slower paced moments like the title track and Imperfect For You do a decent job at, like, slowing things down and adding to the spacey atmosphere. I think that the sequencing is a bit more dodgy with how it handles some of the juggling and pivots that happen. You can tell there's a core idea here trying to tie into, you know, something outside of itself with its interlude and, like, how it progresses through the cattiness that is this toxic relationship that she's trying to hold on to. It also doesn't sound like she wholly wants to be there because of some of the subject matter at hand. There's a lot of drama on display, and that cattiness, again, sometimes falls a little flat in my opinion. I think that this isn't the worst pop album I've heard this year, but it's also not the best. I think in the grander scheme of Ariana's discography, while I didn't think I'd like the more of the time sounds of Thank You Next, I do honestly like them more than some of the focuses on low-key ideas juxtaposed against this drama that happens on display here. I'm going to give this a 5. It's not my least favorite album of the year, but it definitely is a stone's throw from the best pop album in a year where there have been some truly stacked pop albums.
Release intention, suspension of ill feelings and frustrations we be dealing. No, baby, I ain't cheating. Please come with me if you feel it. We need.
Perfect Fantasy was one of those records that I put on hold because it came out at the end of October after Chromacopia dropped, but then by the time GNX dropped, I still hadn't spun it and told myself, well, I guess I'll get to it in December. I honestly really like Earthgang's records. I think that they are a solid twosome that are creating some fun sonic pivots within Southern hip-hop that don't lose sight of those Southern hip-hop roots. I think Perfect Fantasy sees them pushing their own proverbial sounds farther into some space-inspired and vibe-inspired realms. A lot of the synthetic instrumental palette on this feels like a deviation from some of the sound scene on some of their Spillage Village records, which is sort of a co-bill on a lot of this project and some of the DSPs. Along with collaborations like the two-piece of Damon Albarn and Little Dragon out of the gate, it just, again, adds to the more synth-driven textures in some of the backdrops. That I don't think is a bad pivot for them, and I think that as far as, like, having some iconography that leans into that, like, spacey, throwback-inspired nostalgia ideas, they do a decent job at tapping into that sonically to create a solid batch of tracks, but one that I would say definitely overstates its welcome, at least a little bit. Case in point, for every zone or put in work, which is an infectious, funky-ass jam with a catchy hook and some tight verses woven between them. You've got tracks like Blacklight, or the solid instrumentally but still lackluster collaboration with Pharrell, You Gotta, where there isn't much carrying the song outside of an initial hook and the general vibes that the song has going on. And, like, it's crazy because they do pop off on a couple instances on here. Like, I also love the track Bobby Boucher, where they compare the intense anger that the Adam Sandler character faces in the 90s comedy Waterboy with their own pensive frustrations. Or even when they have just some more laid back but still tight rhymes, like on the low-end driven and infectious In My Mind. Other parts of the personality still get to shine, like on Red Flag, where there's this charismatic verse about deconstructing the interwoven trappings of being in the dating scene, especially when you could be somebody who does come into decent money from time to time working in the entertainment industry. But the fact that that song gives way to an almost extended interlude in The Wake, a song that meanders around this tattoo-sounding ass sample without doing a whole lot with it, before going into the guitar-driven, laid-back, and trying to be optimistic Die Today. There's just some moments of jarring pacing across this, with glaring fluff sticking out in the track listing acting as skips the more that I respin this record. I think that if this album were trimmed ever so slightly, it would make for a much better listening experience. It's almost the opposite of that Smino album I covered earlier this month. While I'm kind of glad to see a rap album not get bogged down with some of the broader themes that were discussed over the last year by and large in the genre, I don't think that what Earthgang brings to the table is nearly as interesting as anything going on in other pockets of the genre in the same breath. It's solid, but it's nothing groundbreaking. I'm going to give this a 6 out of 10. I think that if it were trimmed up, it could easily be a 7, because there's some pretty solid jams here.
Get in the room. Cement the brand.
One album I spun throughout December but did not plan to talk about on the listening log was the new Aphex Twin compilation. And it's mostly because a lot of those songs had been out there for an extended period of time already, and I don't think really, while outside of the wheelhouse of Aphex Twin, creatively speaking, it just didn't feel like an album experience. In the same breath, Kim Gordon's newest album, The Collective, has a similar spirit, yet retains an album-like feeling, and I honestly think, even though I've never spun any of her solo work, her history with facets of noise via Sonic Youth, and her, I guess, just ongoing artistry and use of those ideas really culminate to some interesting modern twists with those foundations that I think stick the landing more often than not. There's a clear outcast feeling still laden throughout pockets of this. You know, the Candy House, while having this modern funk-inspired instrumental, the lyrics feel like a sort of double-edged feeling to embracing modernism, and I think that while that's not necessarily a through line on the lyrics on here, it adds that sort of mood and feeling throughout this. I still feel like it's felt throughout the sonic identity of this project. You know, while the harsh percussions and guitars on tracks like Bye Bye and It's Dark Inside and Psychedelic Orgasm, which feel like a 1-2 punch in the middle, where Kim Gordon is just really going to town. Those songs also feel like the grounding of those more out there or modern blendings that creep out of other parts of this record and make it feel more like a unified experience above the aforementioned Aphex Twin collaboration. They're also really fucking great sounding. I love the harsh sounds throughout those songs, and I think that It's Dark Inside and Psychedelic Orgasm are a really good middle pairing of the record, especially when they're sandwiched between the very bass-heavy Trophies and Abstract Treehouse, which sounds like a trip-hop inspired meltdown happening before the listener's ears. I adore how this still feels like a rock album, but it is a rock album that tries to embrace modern ideas in a way that I feel like so many modern bands do at some point in their career, yet still has an understanding of artistry that blends those ideas together. If there was one true moment that I think doesn't necessarily wholly come together, it's Shelf Warmer, and I kind of get what Kim's trying to evoke emotionally with her lyrics and delivery, but I don't think it necessarily brings the album back up post-Treehouse in a way that I think leads well into the last couple of songs. I still think this is a really tight fucking album, though. I know it's going to end up somewhere on my Albums of the Year list because it was on one of my top 10 rock albums of last year. Again, that list is in Blue Sky. But I really enjoy this album. It makes me kind of want to see where Kim Gordon's solo work goes, because there are some really cool, still noise rock driven ideas on here that remind me of why I like her artistry to begin with. I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. This is a strong fucking album, and I absolutely adore the sounds on here.
Is it love or a panic inside? Is it heavy hearts?
Even if I've been pretty harsh on Halsey's music in some facets in the past, and I've never been the biggest fan of her work by and large, even on the projects that I don't necessarily like the tone or mood of, I think there are at least a couple tracks that I can select and pull out of. And her last album I had a lot of love for, if only partially because of an intense bias I had for who produced it. But I thought the overall mood that she was writing with really worked well with Trent Atticus's brand of production. Equally so, I think that her more acoustic-leaning excursions across this new album, The Great Impersonator, create a relatively fruitful, or at least pretty well fleshed out experience, more so than, again, some of the stuff that I've maligned in the past. You know, while I could see she's always been an artist with the vision, I think that whether it's some changes in her life or, you know, doubling down on focusing on vision that may have come after her last album, show a clear through line throughout this newest album that I think connects a lot of the disconnected ideas a little better than they have on some of her past releases. I also just think that, like, her choice to really focus on intimacy really lets a lot of the more personal driven lyrics that she's written with in the past shine even more so on this release. You know, it's still got its catchiness and it's still got its pop appeal and its pop sheen, especially with some of the ways that the choruses of tracks like Panic Attack ring out. And like Panic Attack is a textbook example of, if it sounded differently, I may not like it as much. But the choices made on making this very vintage sounding, groove-laden track that has some crisp production to fuel this song about panic attacks just kind of comes together a lot better for me personally. Similar negative feelings or just sort of negative headspaces getting sort of skirted around or delved into throughout the likes of Hurt Feelings, the impending doom feeling on The End, or the dejected feeling in a song like Dog Years. Again, I think come together a lot better with the production styles and the overall just focus on the sounds around the various moods that she's painting on those songs pretty solidly. I also wasn't sure how I was going to feel when looking at the record on these sort of interludes based on writing from POVs before bringing it around to Halsey's perspective, it feels like. But I honestly think that they are really good at paying tribute to the various inspirations that those letters to God are inspired from, and kind of help tie into the themes of the title of The Great Impersonator. You know, there's a handful of shades amidst this intimate feeling that I think Halsey tries to adorn. And I think that by and large, she does a lot of them pretty amicably. While there is more of like an intimate approach to it, I think that like the facets where she does try to dip around in other realms don't stray too far from those roots. And I think, again, just further act as better, you know, bridges to other ideas than she may have tried in the past. I don't know. This just feels like a more well-rounded experience from Halsey than I'd heard outside of the clear bias from the last album. And I really appreciate the sounds here. I do think it kind of overstays itself a little bit. Some of the real highlights for me sort of bog the project down. But I think that by and large, as far as coming with a vision, being direct with that vision, and even finding ways to build her own little, you know, POV around what she's trying to bring out on this project, I think really, I don't know, they really come together pretty solidly. It's not my favorite album of the year. It wasn't on any of my lists throughout this week, but I did want to talk about it, even though I've been doing these promos and all that sort of stuff and haven't talked about or showcasing the love for this album. Out of the pantheon of like pop-driven records that came out this year, as far as like having a direct idea and still successfully diverging off of it, this is better than some of the other ones I've heard this year. I'm giving this a 7 out of 10. It's honestly pretty fucking solid. Could use with a little bit of a trimming or reining in, but I think that as far as going bold and still hitting the nail on the head pretty consistently, this does a good job of that.
And what we got back, you could've put in your hat, and it was hard.
We lost a lot of icons in 2024, and one that was particularly surprising to me was Steve Albini, partially because this Shellac album dropped at around the same time and still exhibits his talents as a musician and a producer. I don't always agree with everything Albini stands on. He's always been one of those dudes that has been around for long enough in the music industry to have his own defined identity and has stuck to that sound and sonic identity his entire career in the best way possible. The sounds on this are still very clean. Everything pops, but Albini's character from a sonic perspective still permeates throughout this tenfold. When the songs here hit as a unity, as a band, they're all just making bangers. Like, I love the growing, stomping nature of the riff on the opener, WSOD. I love the same way the guitar dances around the different stomping groove on Tattoos. I think that Scabby the Rat is a fucking banger with some lovely bass play. Days Are Dogs is the type of song you would hear everywhere in like 1994 and still sounds just as nice and fresh in 2024. There's a sense of angst still permeating throughout his lyrics, while also finding ways to still write character-driven pieces that still feel as poignant today too, like on Girl From Outside or Chick New Wave, which are an immediate twofer out the gate that feel like observations from a POV and an attitude I haven't heard from in a long enough time as a fan of not just Albini's work, but the era that he grew up in. That being said, there are some songs on here that I don't think wholly come together, like How I Wrote Elastic Man, Cock and Bull. It's one of those kind of like non-songs that have hit better than that one, but that's an example of one that I don't necessarily think I love nearly as much. I kind of feel the same way about Scrappers. While I love the sound of that song, it's not necessarily my favorite amongst this crop of jams. I also kind of just wish this album were insurmountably longer, for as much as I love the mood and the tones of this. It just goes by all too fast. As an album, though, I do still think that for as brief as it feels, what sounds here still feel really nice to hear, and I still like a handful of I still like a lot of what's going on here, even if there are some, you know, missteps or meanderings that happened even in such a small amount of time. I'm still gonna give this a 7 out of 10, because it's a pretty solid record. I don't think I'd recommend it as like a gateway into Shellac, but I think if you're like an old music fan and you want something that sounds like old music in particular, this is gonna give you that. Rest in peace, Steve Albini. And that was what I listened to. Do you agree with my thoughts? Do you disagree? Let me know those in the comments down below, along with any records from 2025 that you are excited to release. While I have the finale of Resident Evil dropping tomorrow, next week is when List Week is going to happen. If you follow me on Blue Sky, I've been doing genre top 10s, or top 10s by genre, I should say, of various genres of music that I happen to listen to a lot of albums in those genres over the last year. Thank you for joining me on this journey throughout 2024 and into 2025. Thank you for also bearing with me as I took some time off. It feels good to be back. I'm excited to do List Week, and I'm excited for the plans that I've got for 2025. Again, thank you just so very much, and hopefully you're excited to see what I've got coming in 2025. I'm going to go. I've been Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lives, and situations, and I'll see you another day.